Good morning and welcome to The Lion and the Sun, New Perspectives on Anglo Japanese Military Relations with me, Ra Mason. This is a symposium hosted at the Centre for Japanese Studies here at the University of East Anglia. And it forms the kick-off event for an exciting new project led by Professor Thomas French of Ritsumeikan University on new partners, perspectives on Anglo-Japanese military relations in the modern era. And this is a project funded by the Japan Society for the Promotion of Science, JSPS, using Kakenhi funds. It brings together a large number of distinguished scholars in the field who are working on different aspects of UK-Japan relations, particularly related to that military sphere. And today we are lucky enough to have 3 papers which initiate that process from the Bakumatsu and Taisho to Showa eras. So really going through the Meiji period and the emergence of Imperial Japan in relation to the established power of Great Britain. And those 3 papers are starting from Tom French's Silent Sentries, writing the British Garrison of Yokohama, 1864 to 1875, back into the history of the Bakumatsu and early Meiji eras. So, very powerful starting point for UK-Japan military relations, and one which feeds nicely into our second paper from Seas Here on Another England at Our Doors, the British Empire, Japan, and the Coming of the Pacific Age, 1895 to 1905, which of course encapsulates that key period in Japanese military history where Japan engaged in the First Sino-Japanese War and the Russo-Japanese War. In many ways, turning points, not just for Japan, but also for Great Britain as the established imperial power. So the relationship between the two becomes increasingly important, particularly in context of things like the forming of the Anglo-Japanese alliance. Then we have a very interesting paper to complete the session from Oleg Benesh on military manoeuvres as public spectacle in Imperial Japan and the UK, where we move just beyond that into an area which extends out into aspects that cover more than simply material power projection. So a very exciting kind of contextual looking paper, and we'll look forward to hearing the comments and questions that might arise from those 3 papers combined. Even better, we are lucky enough today to have with us 2 discussants who are themselves distinguished historians of Japanese political and military history. They are Dr. Sherzod Muminov and Dr. Nadine Willems. So we'll look forward to hearing their comments and, of course, to everybody's questions that come in from the audience. And without further ado, I will hand over to the presenters and let them take it away.
Well, okay. Thank you for having me. This has been a very enlightening set of presentations, and I really have enjoyed the 3 of them. Very rich. Of course, I've got questions, and I'm aware that the questions, you may not be able to answer them right away, but still they may provide a path for future research or further inquiries. So I'm going to start with Tom's presentation on the silent sentries that I enjoyed indeed. First of all, you mentioned the lack of importance attributed to the British garrison in contrast with the attention paid to diplomats and traders. And I think this is a very important point and an interesting aspect, because I'm thinking of the particularly well-documented tensions that existed within the foreign community, for example, at the time of the Richardson affair in 1862. And you mentioned Robert Fletcher's book about the Namamugi incident, and I think he describes these tensions among the traders community, and the traders wanting to take things into their own hands. And it seems indeed that these traders had some kind of influence on the course of events at the time. So what I'm interested in is to find out a little bit more about how these diplomats and traders regard the troops stationed in Yokohama, what kind of interaction, and I'm really talking about interaction even at the smallest, the lowest level of interaction. Did they have interactions with these soldiers? You mentioned the leisure and cultural activities. Was there any chance that they would interact in these circumstances? Or on the other hand, was there any cultural divide to be seen between these traders, diplomat communities, and the soldiers themselves, the garrison? So that's one question I have, and it leads me to another point, which is about sources, because what I found in your presentation is that it's very rich, and yet I couldn't really have a sense of who these soldiers are, who these people that make up the garrison were. So who are they? Their impact is obvious. You describe very well this series of influences that they had or may have had, but yet they don't have a direct voice in your presentation. And I assume it's a question of sources, and it's very difficult, in fact, again, I assume, to find these sources that directly give a voice to these soldiers. But are they letters that they send home? Are they memoirs or diaries? I mean, those soldiers probably had a long career some of them at least, may have had a long career in the army afterwards. So what did they say afterwards about their experience in Yokohama? I think that that would be interesting too. The legacies. I go to my third point, and again I return to the question of interaction. You talk about Satsuma and Choshu, and you mentioned that they abandoned violent opposition to the West, as the value the value of modernized infantry is clearly demonstrated by Shimonoseki and Kagoshima and the Kagoshima campaigns. Now, I'd like to make a very slight correction here. I think, or not a correction, a qualifier really. You talk about violent opposition to the West. It's really violent opposition to Western encroachment into Japan, but not to the West per se. I think that Choshu and I mean, I know you know that, but it's the way to present it. Again, these clans, Choshu and Satsuma, what kind of interaction did they have with these garrisons that came afterwards? And I'm thinking about Blake Glover, who was this British arms merchant based in Nagasaki, and who really developed the sale of arms to these clans. And of course, again, he was a merchant, but did he have any contact afterwards, possibly, with the British garrison? And who was in charge of that British garrison? You know, the motives, Glover's motives and actions are not always clear. And one interpretation is that he was acting as an agent of the British Empire. So I'm just interested to know whether there was any chance that these people would have interacted. And, you know, to summarize, really, was there any chance that the traders and diplomats were in contact with the garrison, people from the garrison, and to what effect? So that's my my response to Tom's presentation. Going to case now. Again, very interesting and different angle used here. The British and Japanese relations in the early 20th century must be understood from a wider perspective. That's what the presentation tells us. What is happening in Australia is also part of the story. And the reactions to these maneuvers from the Australian publics and actors are interesting, and they matter too. So now, of course, I don't know what kind of access to sources or what kind of sources you have access to, but what I'm interested here is how the perceptions were different in Britain and from the reactions in Australia, in its dominion. Were they different? Were these perceptions of the Japanese maneuvers in the Japanese Navy different from what they were in between these two places? And I know you mentioned later on in the presentation the fact that the British had a kind of admiration for the military prowess of the Japanese after the Russo-Japanese War. That was not necessarily shared by the Australians, but you know, I think there's something to do here with this difference of views, perhaps in different places, different locations of the globe. And then you talk about race, and which is of course not surprising that a discourse of racial supremacy could be detected in the exchanges between Japan and the rest of the world at the time. The 1903 maneuvers, you say, are the occasion to recast Japanese status in the eyes of the Australians. It would be interesting to know how the Australians were perceived by the Japanese. This is the other side of the coin, the reverse understanding. I don't know whether you have looked at a book by Shiga Shigetaka, which was who was a geographer, who in not an official geographer, but also mostly part of the establishment, who in 1886, which is of course earlier, wrote a book called Nanyo Jiji, the situation in the South Seas. And he talks about the presence of Great Britain in New Zealand, and mentions how the Maoris are losing their identity, and they are being subsumed, their identity is being subsumed into English culture and ways. And he reflects on the case of Japan, that the Japanese should perhaps keep that in mind when they organize their own strategic and international affairs. So really here it's a question of race, but it's also a question of identity. Who are the Japanese identifying with the, would you say the Maori in this case, or with the colonizers, the Japanese? So I think that how the Australian perceived the Japanese is interesting. How the Japanese perceived the Australians may be also a good way of looking at this. And then, because I'm the only woman on this panel, which is always interesting, I'm not necessarily preoccupied with all these gender issues usually, but I think in this case you raised some interesting point, and it's about gender and masculinity. I find it intriguing, and especially when you talk about this Vice Admiral Shimamura, and how he was praised for his physical features, but on the other hand, it was not very well accepted that the Japanese would mingle with Australian girls or women. So how do we reconcile this? You know, you talk about the display of athletic prowess and how it was part of these maneuvers, basically part of the whole spectacle, which is very interesting. But how do we reconcile these praising of masculinity and military prowess with the criticism of mingling, the racial mingling in this case. So this is for case. Enjoyed that. Enjoyed very much Oleg's presentation too, which I'm turning to now. It's very rich, it's intriguing. Now, I've got a very heavy question here, which is, what is it about, really? Is it about war? I mean, all these maneuvers that you describe in, you know, with the expansion in time and in location, is it about war? Is it about national identity? Is it about international status? I think here we need to know more about what you're after, so that we can understand what is in here. I mean, I know it's the beginning of a work, and you probably don't possibly know yourself what you're after this point, but I wanted to know how these illustrations actually related to some particular theme that you had identified. It could be war, but it could be other things too. I was really interested also in your view that location mattered, and this is, you know, we need some kind of spatial or space understanding of space here, because what you point out very well is that these maneuvers were taking place not only in the capital like Tokyo or main cities like Osaka, but in provincial places too, like Nagoya, Fukuoka, Osaka, and so Nagoya, Fukuoka, and Aichi Prefecture. I mean, other places too. So I'm just wondering, was there a different meaning to attach to these military maneuvers in the provinces, different goals, different objectives, that these for which these maneuvers were held in provincial places? I mean, the answer may be obvious, but you may also find that there were, you know, vested local interest in these maneuvers that also makes sense. How different is the province from the capital? So that I thought is very interesting. And a related question, although it's more theoretical than practical here, is really how space was utilized, because if we talk about location, is location in the country, but the actual use of space is quite interesting. How much did it spread, and what did it mean? Some kind of occupation of space. Did it mean anything in particular? People, that's one thing I want to highlight for all presentations, actually. To me, there are not enough people involved. I know Case mentioned the Vice Admiral Shimamura, which is possibly the only person we come across with a real name and face. Who are these people? You talk about the military attaché. I suppose that you're familiar with Karl Haushofer, who was a German military attaché in Japan in 1908, and how influential his ideas of Lebensraum were for Japan. Again, can we make some interaction here? Can we see some links between these real people and what was happening on the maneuvers front? And then, my last point is that you talk about these maneuvers being part of the social fabric, which is a very important point indeed. What I want to understand is how well these maneuvers were accepted, enjoyed, understood, whether there was some opposition from the local people, possibly. You talk about soft power, and I really think that in this particular case you need to give a definition of what soft power is in this context and what it was trying to achieve through these maneuvers. So this is, in a very quick summary, all these points I wanted to raise. And as I say, I'm not a military historian, so this is not my field, but I think it's interesting to consider military history as a social and cultural history, and I hope that I have brought about a few questions that you may want to answer in the future. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Nadine. So I think now, if hopefully the presenters will have taken some notes on those questions. They're very comprehensive. So could we perhaps hand over to Sherzad for his discussion points as well?
Can you hear me?
Yes,
I hope you can hear me, yes. First of all, I'd like to thank Tom for organizing such a fascinating event with 3 very interesting papers. I really enjoyed all 3 presentations. I have some questions and comments, and I'd like to make some parallels as I go. I like to speak in metaphors, so please warn me if there are too many metaphors in what I say. So I really like I'd like to start with 2 general points. I really liked the fact that every one of these 3 papers looks at an episode that has been either ignored or has been understudied in Anglophone literature, and by that they shed light on transnational, international aspects of history, and they are all based on rich archival and visual material, which really which provides us with, you know, visual representation of the times, but also of what people cared about at the time. And the second point, in all 3 papers, we can discern gazes. I use this as a metaphor. 2 gazes. One of them is the gaze of the world trained on Japan, and the second, of course, the Japanese gaze, which at the same time views the world as this new place. And again, I don't want to emphasize this too much, because new, old, secluded, open, those are not always clear-cut. But looking at what Japan was, especially Tom's paper, which looks at the early Meiji period, and looking at some of the scholarship that has come out, for example, Mark Ravina's book, To Stand with the Nations of the World, we can see in all of these in all of these encounters that each of you look into, how Japan viewed the world and how the world viewed Japan, how Japan actually tried to become a so-called westernized, modernized nation, but also what went wrong later on in the run-up to the Second World War. So I'd like to spend a few minutes on each paper. I will start with Tom's paper. I really liked the fact that you have chosen this Garrison. It has been ignored in scholarship. There have been a few Japanese accounts, but very few Anglophone studies of this. I also like the fact that you point out one of the major reasons for this neglect is that it has slipped through the cracks of history subfields, which often happens, and which I think you do well to point out and also to counter in your work. And the whole story is really fascinating. You have this British soldiers in Japan and how they spend their time, what they do for work, and how they socialize. The location, the slopes of Yokohama, quite interesting. I think I like several points about this research. The first point is I like the fact that you are trying to reconsider the history of treaty ports, and this is one of the neglected aspects of not only just Japanese history, but also international global history in general. I like the fact that I just mentioned how different Japan was to what we know now, and your paper has the potential to bring out these contrasts, you know, these contradictions Japan as a backwater, Japan that has nothing modern about it, but which is willing maybe partly because it has no other choice, but also because there is genuine fascination with all things Western, especially British. And this is another point I'd like to bring up, is that the idea of Great Britain as an example, its status as something to aspire to. And this idea, actually, I don't know if anybody has done any research on this. I just read different things from different periods, even starting from Meiji, but then going on to even during the Cold War period, the metaphor of Japan being the Great Britain of the East, as in Great Britain in the Pacific Ocean for the United States interests. That these metaphors, these comparisons, these two shimaguni, they keep coming up. So I think this paper has potential to hit all those points. I mean, if you want to do that. So I have a couple of questions. First question is, Nadine also raised this very briefly. So you call them silent sentries, and they are silent. So very simply, how are you going to make them not silent? What are you going to emphasize, and what sources are you going to base your story about them? Another question would be cultural and just human exchange on the level of Japanese, on the level of ordinary people. If there is any exchange, and if that exchange is there, how is it received and represented in the Japanese public sphere? One parallel that comes to mind is the GIs in occupied Japan, which is the period that you know very well. You know, the candies and the jeeps, you know, all of these metaphors, all of these ideas with which you associate a smiling American soldier who is giving out candies to Japanese children. Is there anything like that? Are there encounters between ordinary Japanese and these soldiers? You mentioned some influence, but were there any direct exchanges and influence between Japanese army and the garrison? As in, were there any direct, training drills, anything in which Japanese military or civilian leaders are considering this garrison, and they are looking at this as something they can learn from or otherwise? So that's my points for Tom. Now I move to Kei's paper. Absolutely fascinating paper, especially the fact that you look at political and symbolic significance of these rituals and how ritualized celebration of naval power is a global phenomenon. It's not something that we should confine within the narrow containers of the nation state. And I also liked, another point I liked that you made is the necessity or the importance of looking at the links not only between metropoles when we study history of empires or imperial relations, but also the history of the relations between colonies. And this brought to mind Professor Umemori Naoyuki of Waseda University. His work, his very recent work, I don't know if he's published it because I've listened to it in a keynote, in which he highlights the role of British colonies or French colonies in the making of Japanese empire. And he gives the example of how the Japanese policemen, the founding fathers of the Tokyo Metropolitan Police, studied very meticulously how the French ran their colonies, because Japan wanted to see how the Western empires handled these subject populations. Another parallel that I discern is the fact that navy and naval power and naval prowess is seen as a prop for the nation's prestige. And this is a trend of the times. One example I would like to highlight is perhaps the mission of William Braisted, a US Navy doctor, who in 1905 visited Japan to study the state of Japanese war medicine and sanitation during the Russo-Japanese War, and actually was rather impressed by what he saw. He produced a report in which he says Japanese sanitation is way ahead our own US Navy sanitation. And in a way, this is seen as a surprise. You know, how can a nation like Japan be superior to us? So that, and also on the issue of treatment of the Russian POWs, he was also very impressed. So all of these encounters, the encounters that you mentioned in Australia, and what happens with Westerners coming to Japan and trying to get an understanding of how this little nation in their mind is punching above its weight, and how that in itself is fed back to Japan to boost national pride and to boost this idea of, oh, we can be equal, we can do as well as the West is doing. I just to move on to, I have other points, but I'd like to just maybe to move on to questions. It would be really interesting to know what kind of response or reflections this, the Japanese squadron visits to Australia sparked on the Japanese side, because this is very rich material for Japanese kind of Nihon Jinron. They weren't called Nihon Jinron at the time, but this kind of exceptionalism, nationalist theories in which Japan is seen as this, you know, the sole nation in Asia that has successfully modernized, the sole nation in Asia that has actually stood up to the West, which leads me to my second question. The two visits that you mentioned, if I'm not mistaken, they were in 1903 and 1906, and obviously a very, very important momentous event happens in between them, in which Japan beats up a Western white imperial power at its own game. So how do the perceptions in Australia or in Britain or globally change between these two visits? Does the Japanese victory in the Russo-Japanese War you know, lead to reconsiderations? Does it lead to Japan being maybe portrayed as a threat or as an equal? Is Japan being less racially discriminated against? Because if you look at the so-called Third World or the colonies, Japan was instantly lionized. Japan was instantly, you know, to a point that a Turkish feminist writer, Halide Edip, named her son Togo in the wake of Japan's victory over Russia. So Japan's image in the Third World or in the colonies is very, very different after its victory in the Russo-Japanese War. So I don't have time, but maybe I can give you some of the other points later. And finally, to move to Oleg's paper, another fascinating paper, very visual, very rich, beautiful postcards. The idea of focusing on these events, on maneuvers and on spectacles, actually brought the, this brought up this parallel just yesterday. I'm sure you're all aware, in Moscow, there was the postponed military parade for the Victory Parade, which was supposed to be usually held on the 9th of May, but was postponed, and the Russian government found a compromise date of the 24th of June, which was the date on which the Soviet soldiers had laid German banners in 1945 on the Red Square. Anyway, yesterday's parade, which I haven't watched, I won't watch, but in a way, it's a way in which the nation state displays, besides shiny armor and well-drilled soldiers, its propensity to use military ritual to reinforce its primacy as the most important community, as the dominant community in which humans organize themselves. In a way, events that that you highlight. With hindsight, we can see that they are the rituals of the making of the nation, in which the nation co-opts the general public into its embrace, and it does it, especially in the period that all three papers look broadly into. It does it through military, through popularizing the military. So, and the question I have is, so how are you going to shed light, my first question, into these processes of nationalization of society, but also the militarization of society? Because at the period that you look at, yet Japan's military and Japan's nation state haven't been tarnished by the atrocities that the military committed. It hasn't been tarnished by, you know, this bad image of the militarist bad apples. And in a way, there is so much benevolence and interest, both on the part of the Japanese society itself, but also abroad, that these things are legitimate. These things are not only legitimate, they are also actually attractive to people who have no idea what the state is trying to do, who might not have a deep understanding of how the nation state works and what it's trying to do on the international and the domestic scenes, but who still come because it's fascinating, because it's colorful, because it's, you know, masculine, because it's so many other things. Another question I'd like to ask is the foreign observers. You mentioned Dresser, for example, and some others. So what do they make of it? How do they make sense of Japan? Or does their perception of Japan change when they witness these spectacles? And finally, again, echoing my colleague's point, what form is this research going to take? If you can share with us, what do you want to achieve with it? What kind of end product in an industry which is, you know, in a ref-based industry where, you know, we are all obsessed with outcomes? Is this going to be a book? Is this going to be an article? So that is where I stop. I'm sorry I took a lot of time, but I have other points and questions, so we can maybe talk later. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Sherzod as well. So a fantastic range of questions and kind of lines of investigation there. Could we have Tom, then Kays, then Oleg to answer in or respond in order, please? Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks very much. Again, really productive discussion, really productive questions as well. So I'll address, well, both of them together, I suppose. Nadine's side, the importance of the garrisons vis-a-vis traders, yeah, I certainly agree. Again, the role of traders and interaction with the garrison itself, they have a lot to do with one another in terms of social events. Like a lot of the, how should we say, sort of evenings out are based around music provided by the bands of these regiments. Again, there's lots of social interaction inside of the various clubs that they have, so they're very closely connected. Again, when they leave, actually before that, the traders present like this gold cup to one of the regiments before it goes as like a kind of token of their esteem and their thanks for protecting the settlement and looking after them. So they're very interlinked in that sense. I think there's less interaction, how should we say, between the kind of French troops there, there's a French garrison as well, and the British and the French side, and some of the population, they're a little bit more isolated in a way. But yeah, they're very, very closely interconnected. And again, when they depart, there's sort of regret, I suppose, expressed, like the local population sort of says, oh, we really, you know, wish you could stay and you gave us such help and stuff in the past. So they're very interconnected. Again, there is pressure to do more, I suppose, often from the traders' side. Again, towards the end of their presence, the local population, if you want to use that term, the foreign population really wants these troops to stay. even though they're in quite small numbers at that point. Whereas the home governments, Britain and France, both want to withdraw them, but not before the other, because there's a bit of imperial competition going on there too. So generally pretty positive. The local population also looks to its own defence in a sense. It creates like the Yokohama volunteers in several iterations, like a paramilitary force to protect itself. And before these troops are present, they kind of patrol the streets armed at certain times of perceived danger themselves. So they certainly appreciate the presence. They're very much in favour of it, as I said, and also there's a high degree of social interaction. Again, the work by Hall, for example, he's quite famous sort of first-person account. He talks about being friends with one of the commanders of the British garrison, for example, going around for dinner and things like that privately. On to the next point about sources, raised, of course, also by Sherzod. Who they are? Well, I mean, again, this is like mid-19th century British soldiers. So a lot of the rank and file are illiterate, for example, but a lot of the officers, well, all of them, of course, are literate. A few of them produce memoirs of their accounts or other books related to Japan. So we do have those. I mean, again, it's part of the source material I need to get into a bit more. I've collected them all, so that's on my list to do. We also have other accounts we can look at, things like the diplomats of the time, Sato, again, the papers of Parkes, the Foreign Office, and other material. But there's also sort of admiralty material, the service records of the various individuals involved. There's medical records, because there is, I mean, I didn't mention it in my narration, but the green part of the timeline is there's a kind of cholera outbreak. So we can look into the health of the community. We have a lot of stuff about the sort of social history aspects, what they do day to day, their training, their diet, for example, and various other things from medical records. So there's a lot more there I can build in and weave in. I think the final production of this, I'll look to add in quite significant detail on the kind of their life and again, accounts that exist, etc. What else do we have on there? A question about sources. Was there anything else from Sherzod on that side? Yeah, the exchange, the public sphere, interactions between the troops and the Japanese. They actually get along quite well with the Japanese guards of the legation. Most of the time, there's an attempt by one of the guards to kill some of them at another time, but they do kind of maneuvers together. Again, something I should probably discuss in greater length with Oleg, which are kind of outings for the whole population of the settlement. They're called field days, as it were, older meaning of that phrase, but they go out and do maneuvers together. They do kind of display with one another, often with shogunal and British and other diplomats present to sort of demonstrate their martial ability either side. There's some informal training that goes on, again, something that I'll look at in more detail in the final version. Interaction with the local population. Again, you talk about GIs, of course, prostitution is an element. Again, some of their recreation, if you want to use that term. Interaction with local children and others, giving out sweets. Don't see, I haven't encountered so much of things like that inside the sources, but as they're providing, as I mentioned, the kind of police force for the settlement itself, there must have been interactions, and again, the kind of court records, court proceedings published in some of the local newspapers is another avenue I want to look at in terms of their dealings with the locals. So yeah, more to do on that front as well. What else are we looking at here? So again, the legacies, again, I agree with this idea. I mean, again, the phraseology there of foreign encroachment or foreign presence would be better, so that'll be updated. Again, the usage of the infantry really is only in the very end of the Shimonoseki, or parts of Shimonoseki. Kagoshima is just a naval bombardment of Kagoshima by the Royal Navy. So it helps maybe indicate the power and strength of influence of modernized military forces for these two fiefs. So yeah, that's certainly there. The interactions over arms sales, again, Glover, etc. Glover and Parkes have a kind of noted meeting where they discuss matters at length. Again, there's a sort of historiographical debate over how far Parkes is trying to support the shogunate while also maybe playing a double game and attempting to foster kind of Meiji elements. Again, Gordon Daniels and various others have discussed this. Parks is heavily connected, of course, to the garrison. I mean, bits of it provide his armed guard. They're with him all the time. Again, parts of them fight, if you want to use that term, alongside him when various different people try and take his life. So he's intimately connected with them. And as I mentioned, they're part of his so-called toolbox. So we can use that if we need to, or we have the potential to use that if we need to, against forces inside Japan, or again to deter actions from outside. Connections between Glover, Satsuma, for example. I mean, I think it's Dr. Willis, one of the legation surgeons, goes down and works in Satsuma. Again, there's an example, I can't remember the name off the top of my head either, of a British officer, I think it's from the garrison, who's also hired to go down and do some training of military forces in Satsuma later. So there are connections there, but it's not perhaps directly between Glover and the garrison itself. That's very much under the control of and within the sphere of Harry Parkes and the other British ministers to Japan. And I think that's about everything, really. Again, thanks for all your comments. Thanks for all the various different bits. It's been very, very interesting indeed. Again, I've got a response to the question about woodblock prints, but I'll save that for when it comes up after my co-panelists' further responses. So thank you very much. Again, really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you. Shall I go next? Thank you, first of all, to Nadine and Sherzod for your insights and comments and questions. I hope that I'll be able to sort of recall and respond to them all. I suppose the place to start would be just to sketch some of the context here. What, of course, these visits form part of the larger narrative is Japan's entry into what contemporary international relations specialists refer to as international society, but what at the time was tended to be referred to as the Committee of Civilized Nations. And I suppose the thing that I would have wanted to stress in this paper is that this is, of course, not an isolated event, right? We tend to sort of think of Japan's integration in the international sphere through the lens of treaty revision and sort of lay the stress on the bilateral negotiations that go on between Japan and the treaty powers. How I've positioned it here is really to see that attempt by Japan to have itself accepted as part of that international system, to see that in a wider context of state and empire building within the Asia Pacific. One that Japan is part of, but it is not the only participant, right? The timing about the late 19th, early 20th century, we also have the Russian Empire moving eastward, establishing its own naval bases at Vladivostok. You have the great American westward leap across the Pacific with the Spanish-American War. You have even sort of by colonial regimes in the region, the Dutch, for instance, a very distinct and determined effort to kind of firm up the boundaries of their colonial possessions. So Australia, Japan are both sort of part of this kind of wider process of nation and empire building in the Pacific that brings the two of them closer into contact and conversation with one another. And there are those kind of interactions where you see these state building projects responding to one another, thinking about one another, seeking kind of points of emulation, as Sherzod suggested. But from the Japanese side, the settling of Australia, of Canada and the United States, the kind of great spread of white Anglo-Saxon settlers into these lands during the 19th century is sort of embraced as part of the package of modernity, right? And this goes all the way back to the scholarship of Akira Irie, but the way that migration and expansion, overseas trade become very clearly identified with the idea of modernity. From the Australian side, there's obviously a very clear awareness of Japan that features into its own nation-building projects. There's common intellectual parallels you see really on both sides. You see references to the work of the British historian J.R. Seeley, who's sort of very influentially putting forward these ideas of the global shrinking of distances, the shrinking of geographical space. So I see them very much as connected in dialogue and responding to one another, which is why I think these visits, in a sense, are quite so interesting, because it's not just the Japanese that are on display in these visits to Melbourne and Sydney. It's also the Australians putting themselves on display and offering themselves up for examination for how well they are receiving these visitors and how capable they show themselves to be to engage in this kind of ceremony and reception and, in a sense, public diplomacy that is usually the purview of sovereign states. So this is quite a new phenomenon, and it's, in a sense, the Australians themselves also showing off that they are capable of acting as a nation. And I see this, I mean, obviously, the clear counterpoint here is the problem of race and of Australian racism. The tension here, of course, is that these visits take place constantly against the background of a white Australia that has been declared 2 years before, and in a sense serve the purpose of using the military in its symbolic form to create this space in which Japan can be treated as an equal. And I see this really as part of this kind of response to the Anglo-Japanese alliance, the Japanese victory in the Russo-Japanese War, where even from the Australian side, there's a clear recognition that Japan needs to be treated to engage with Japan as a sovereign state that inhabits the same kind of oceanic environment. In part, you can see this as a strategy to remove this sort of hot button issue of white Australia sort of really from the relationship and really stress this kind of shared sense of statehood, to place the emphasis on military ritual, on kind of these elite social encounters that are taking place in the governor's house. These are all sort of ways to stress, look, we are willing to accept to have a dialogue with the Japanese as sovereign states, really, which is something that reflects on Japan as well as on Australia. I hope that I'm able to sort of cover some of these kind of very rich questions that I received, and which have given me much food for thought here. The concept of gender and how gender plays into this is something that I'm still chewing on. I find very interesting. It is, I think, in a sense, part of this effort to create kind of common registers of dialogue in which Japan can be, in a sense, equalized, right? So you can have, one of the great things about these kind of sporting competitions is that it eliminates these kind of sense of prejudice and hierarchy, and it allows Japanese sailors and British tars to engage directly in sort of directly comparable displays of athletic prowess. And if you see the sort of things that the Japanese soldiers get praised for, it is usually the sort of things that we see kind of reflected in the rhetoric on British sailors as well. So there's even some commentaries during the Russo-Japanese War, for instance, where you see the term sort of Anglo-Saxon being used to describe the physical qualities of the Japanese army at war. So it is part of sort of creating this kind of cultural language, in a sense, to flesh out the diplomatic relationship that is the Anglo-Japanese alliance, to give that some more sort of cultural meat on its bones, and to use that, to refer to that as a way to sidestep these kind of issues of racial difference, which as are especially present in the Australian case, but I think are very much there on the British side as well. So that's how I conceive of this. I would love to know. I haven't been able to get materials on this, and I would love to know more about to what extent these visits are also conceived on the side of the Japanese Navy as acts of public diplomacy. Whether that sort of having that reception in Australia, they go to Canada as well, whether that is part of the purpose of making these visits. I strongly suspect that given the timing, that is part of it, but I haven't been able so far to sort of find direct evidence that speaks to those kinds of intentions. So once again, lots of food for thought there, and thank you so much for the comments. It's certainly been a very enriching experience for me. I'll happily give it over to Oleg now, because I think we're already running out of time.
All right, see if things are working here. I hope so. Skype is a bit odd. I don't see myself, but perhaps you can.
We can see you. We can see you nice and clear, Oleg.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks, Rod. Make use of that. Yeah. No, thank you for organizing, and then also, yes, many thanks to Nadine and Sherzad. And I would probably start again with an apology that I had in my presentation as well. And I think both Nadine and Sherzad really kind of got to the heart of this with questions like, what is it about? What will it be? Those are excellent and very justified questions. I'm less concerned about the ref usually. So, I mean, don't send this on to my departmental ref manager. But yes, what will it be? So, I mean, I think one thing this gets to is one of the issues I had is kind of I've lost the last 4 months research-wise, mainly on the altar of administration rather than more serious things, thankfully. And so the time that when I was actually really going to try to answer these questions in a bit more detail and look at the materials I've got here and what I was originally thinking last year when I proposed this has kind of evaporated. So what I've essentially presented is a mix of a few different things that also goes in some of the directions I was looking towards. And I mean, the questions Nadine and Sherzad asked are very helpful for that as I pursue, not just with this, but as I pursue some other related research. The first question from Nadine about, is it war, is it national identity, is it international status? I think potentially it is all of these. Which of these I'm going to focus on? I mean, I think it's actually more in the things I'm looking at here. I think it is probably more about this issue of national identity. And I mean, Sherzad asked the question about kind of the nationalization of kind of the public in society, how you bring the public in there. And so a lot of this actually so far comes from the book Ron Zweigenberg and I wrote last year on Japan's castles, where we looked at a lot of these things kind of within that castle space. Nadine asked kind of this question about space. And that's something we've really looked at in terms of castles, is how this urban space was used by the military, how the parade grounds were used, how the spectacles of these maneuvers in the kind of urban castles were used to kind of bring the general public in. And that's where we also address these issues of, say, soft power. This issue of opposition that Nadine raises is a very important one. And this is something we really see very explicitly in the case of these urban garrisons that are usually based in castles. But I'm sure this is something that's going on elsewhere as well. And that's what I'd like to explore here is, getting beyond, especially Tokyo, Osaka, and looking at more regional cities and, getting beyond the castle garrisons, looking at smaller towns that have military presences, looking and also expanding this to the Navy, I think the larger naval bases. And I think that's one of the main things I want to be looking at here is how maneuvers are used to tie kind of regional Japan into the nation, but then also what are these kind of I guess more global kind of international aspects that we're looking at here. That, you know, suddenly these grand maneuvers that took place, the Army grand maneuvers I think were roughly every year, naval grand maneuvers were I think every 4 years roughly, but the Army's grand maneuvers, you know, you would suddenly have descend upon Fukui, which I mean is a fairly exciting place most times. But, you know, suddenly descending upon Fukui, you know, you would have this enormous military presence. You would have the emperor. You would suddenly have these foreign military observers. There would be all sorts of rituals. It would incorporate shrines. The city hall or maybe schools or universities would be turned into kind of the imperial general headquarters for these maneuvers. And these are, I think, there's been quite a bit of work, kind of scholarship done in the past on, I mean, some like Smethurst's work on kind of the military in kind of rural Japan, looking at kind of the Reservist Association. I think there's been a bit less done on these kind of rural maneuvers. There's more research done in Japanese, especially on very specific events in specific towns. But there's not much that I've seen in terms of tying it together a bit more. And so that's part of kind of a larger project I'm looking at that I'd like to incorporate here. But what interests me, I guess, in the context of this kind of conference and larger project is this kind of international element. I mean, what purpose are these international observers serving? I showed, you know, I've got dozens of these big volumes and descriptions of the maneuvers, many photographs. I mean, you will always see the photograph of the foreign observers, but, you know, what role are they playing? Who are they? You know, is this just something that will show how important the Japanese military is and kind of reinforce that to the people in the provinces to kind of show this international recognition of the military, the maneuver, the event? You know, you've got the emperor attending as well. I guess the other aspect of that, which I'm interested here, which I only touched on a little bit at the end of the presentation, also because I was running out of time, and didn't want to go too far over at that point, but is looking at more of these accounts by foreigners who have witnessed this sort of thing in Japan. I mean, I mentioned Christopher Dresser, who witnesses a bit of that, and he witnesses a bit of the conflict actually between the military and the civilian authorities. For example, when foreign visitors want to visit Nagoya Castle, you know, the mayor says, "Oh yeah, come down, I'll show you the castle," and they get to the castle, and the military commander says, "No, you can't come in, this is ours. Yeah, the mayor has no jurisdiction here." And then cue hours of wrangling and negotiation. So I would like to look at that in kind of smaller regional areas, what kind of conflicts we have there, and how I think many foreigners will have experienced those sorts of things, and we do have those in the accounts. And then the other side of this, which I touch on at the very end, is looking at, you know, what kind of influences there are on the development of this. I mean, I mentioned the Iwakura mission, and I mentioned just a little bit about the UK, but one of the things that really comes out in that is everywhere they go, they are just witnessing military maneuvers. If it's the Germans, if it's the British, if it's the French, if it's the Americans, they take them to go see drill and maneuvers, and these are often public spectacles. And so that aspect of it, looking a bit more at what those European models are exactly, and how they influence the kind of development of the Japanese maneuvers, then is something I'm very much interested in. And I think that's probably, if I'm allowed to conduct any more research sometime in the future. They've just extended our term by 3 weeks. then that's something I would like to look at. And finally, just Sherzad mentioned kind of the point of the gaze, and I think in terms of the maneuvers, that's something I'd be very much interested in. And the imperial gaze is obviously one of the biggest factors here. I mean, Fujitani talks quite a bit about maneuvers in the context of Tokyo and the imperial gaze, but that's the thing. Looking out into the provinces, whose and what gaze are we talking about there? So I think also given time, I might just leave it there. But yes, thank you for all your wonderful questions and insights.
Thank you very much, Oleg. So there are actually some external questions, but I think seeing as we are now over time, I'm going to have to, let's say, delegate that to the project as a whole to answer as it develops. I think we've had 3 fantastic presentations, some excellent discussion, and all it really remains for me to do is to thank all the participants very much, thank our administrator and our hosts, and I will hand back over to Ollie to wrap up. Thank you.